Big Bash T20 Cricket League Season 2025-26. Here is complete schedule. Match number 1. Perth Scorchers vs Melbourne Stars on 21st December. Match number 2. Sydney Sixers vs Melbourne Renegades on 22nd December. Match number 3. Sydney Thunders vs Adelaide Strikers on 23rd December. Match number 4. Melbourne Stars vs Brisbane Heat on 24th December. Match number 5. Melbourne Renegades vs Hobart Hurricanes on 26th December. Match number 6. Adelaide Strikers vs Melbourne Stars on 26th December. Match number 7. Hobart Hurricanes vs Perth Scorchers on 27th December. Match number 8. Sydney Sixers vs Sydney Thunders on 28th December. Match number 9. Brisbane Heat vs Adelaide Strikers on 28th December. Match number 10. Melbourne Renegades vs Perth Scorchers on 29th December. Match number 11. Sydney Sixers vs Melbourne Stars on 30th December. Match number 12. Perth Scorchers vs Brisbane Heat on 30th December. Match number 13. Adelaide Strikers vs Hobart Hurricanes on 31st December. Match number 14. Sydney Thunders vs Melbourne Stars on 31st December. Match number 15. Brisbane Heat vs Sydney Sixers on January 1st. Match number 16. Sydney Thunders vs Melbourne Renegades on January 2nd. Match number 17. Adelaide Strikers vs Perth Scorchers on January 2nd. Match number 18. Hobart Hurricanes vs Sydney Sixers on January 3rd. Match number 19. Brisbane Heat vs Melbourne Stars on January 4th. Match number 20. Melbourne Renegades vs Adelaide Strikers on January 5th. Match number 21. Brisbane Heat vs Sydney Sixers on January 6th. Match number 22. Perth Scorchers vs Sydney Thunders on January 6th. Match number 23. Melbourne Renegades vs Melbourne Stars on January 7th. Match number 24. Hobart Hurricanes vs Adelaide Strikers on January 8th. Match number 25. Brisbane Heat vs Sydney Thunders on January 8th. Match number 26. Perth Scorchers vs Melbourne Renegades on January 9th. Match number 27. Sydney Thunders vs Hobart Hurricanes on January 9. Match number 28. Melbourne Stars vs Sydney Sixers on January 10th. Match number 29. Hobart Hurricanes vs Sydney Thunders on January 11th. Match number 30. Sydney Sixers vs Perth Scorchers on January 12th. Match number 31. Adelaide Strikers vs Brisbane Heat on January 13th. Match number 32. Melbourne Renegades vs Melbourne Stars on January 14th. Match number 33. Sydney Thunders vs Perth Scorchers on January 15th. Match number 34. Hobart Hurricanes vs Melbourne Renegades on January 15th. Match number 35. Adelaide Strikers vs Sydney Sixers on January 16. Match number 36. Sydney Sixers vs Sydney Thunders on January 17. Match number 38. Melbourne Renegades vs Brisbane Heat on January 18. Match number 39. Perth Scorchers vs Adelaide Strikers on January 18. Match number 40. Melbourne Stars vs Hobart Hurricanes on January 19. Qualifier match will be played on January 21st. The knockout match will be played on January 22nd. The challenger match will be played on January 23rd. The final match will be played on January 25th.